Introduction to my life story, The Life and Times of Lyman Capel Peterson, and the introduction to that book. The beginning of the years of my life started with the world in a turmoil. World War I had ended and the Depression was in full swing. World War II was going strong, and what could I say about coming into an era of dark and gloomy circumstances? Well, I didn't have anything to say about anything, did I? Just to give you an idea of all that was going on, January the 1st, 1933, Hitler took over Germany as Chancellor. April the 4th, 1933, the persecution of the Jews started. April the 9th, 1940, Hitler took over Denmark and Norway. May the 8th, 1940, Churchill became the President of England. Well, the Prime Minister, at least, for England. December the 7th, 1941, the Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. April 1943, the Jewish Holocaust was in full swing. July through September 1943, there was major battles in Europe. June the 6th, 1944, was D-Day. August the 6th, 1945, the A-bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Then, August the 6th, 1945, the A-bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. During everything else happening, the stock market crashed on October the 29th, 1929, and that brought about the Great Depression, which lasted until the end of the Second World War, August the 15th, 1945. So here I was born right in the middle of everything, and I didn't know what was going on. I came into the world August the 28th, 1943 in Payson, Utah. I remember very little about my childhood, but what I remember I'll tell you. My mom was Wilda Capel Peterson. She was just a small child. Her parents moved to a mining town above Eureka, Utah by the name of Mammoth, Utah. It is now a ghost town and has been for several years. Her father worked in the mines in Eureka, and then the great flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919, which killed over 100 million people worldwide, killed Mom's parents and left all of the kids homeless. Utah was the second state in the United States for the recorded deaths by this epidemic. And in Utah, there were 2,343 people that passed away. South Carolina was the only state that had more deaths in it. The children were all taken by family services and adopted out to different families. Mom ended up with a family in Payson, Utah by the name of Lyman and Phoebe Capel. Well, Grandma and Grandpa Capel were childless, and they were so glad to just have Wilta as their little daughter. Later, she would be sealed to them in the Salt Lake Temple. In her new family, she would travel throughout Utah, Arizona, as Grandpa Capel took all sorts of jobs to keep the wolf away from the door at that time. Grandpa Capel was a handyman. He was one of those special men that was always trying to make $1 million on some project or other. Well, on to my family. My dad was my greatest hero. He was born in Lehi, Utah, September the 26th, 1909. And he died July the 30th, 1986 in Bunkerville, Nevada. He spent his early years working on a small farm that the family owned in Snowflake, Arizona. In the summertime, He and his dad would peddle the produce they raised on their little farm to local towns around the area in Arizona. And he was the only oldest child in the family. It turned out their family had 7 boys and 1 girl. And as such, he became the one to set the example of hard work that his dad demanded of all the children. Since the Peterson home was on the outskirts of Snowflake, Arizona, he stayed with his uncle's family during the winter time when he got into high school. Since it was winter time and it was cold in Snowflake, and the uncle's home was too small even for his own family, Dad had to sleep outside under a tarp in the snow. Many times he would wake up in the morning with his tarp frozen solid, and the frozen ground under the few blankets he slept on did not add any more to the cold and the wetness sleep that he had to endure. When Dad turned 8 years old, he was supposed to be baptized, and it was in the middle of the winter time. The family made arrangements to baptize him in the creek that ran just outside of town. So that Saturday, as Dad hitched up the old horse to the wagon and gathered everyone together, when they finally got to the creek, they had to break about an inch of ice from the frozen water. Well, Dad said he had already decided that he would not be baptized in water that had big chunks of ice floating around in it, so he crawled far back underneath the wagon seat, and then he'd kick anyone that tried to pull him out. He was baptized the next summer, it's noted. Dad told us about his young life and his summers, like when he worked on the lookout towers in the forest around Cholo, Arizona, and the time he was in the CCC camp, and that was during the Depression and during the war, the Second World War. Since he was the oldest son, he stayed home and helped out his parents during the Second World War, while his brothers went off to fight in the different military services. Then there was the story of how he wooed and won my mother. He borrowed an old Model T Ford, drove to Mesa, Arizona, and they got married in the temple between Christmas and the New Year's. And all this was done with my dad having only 50 cents in his pocket. They spent their honeymoon night at a relative's home. I remember him as an extremely quiet man. He never spanked us. He hardly ever lost his temper. I remember one day when my mother got mad at him and slapped him several times across the face. He never said or did anything in retaliation. I don't know what it was all about, but he just walked outside, went back to work in his shop. At times I really felt sorry for him. He always claimed that he was a bishop in Bunkerville Ward for the shortest time of any bishop that was called there. At that time, it seemed like there had been a lot of hard feelings among all of the people in Bunkerville. And Dad, being a move-in, an outsider, so to speak, was called to quell the bad feelings. I guess it was like pouring oil on water to calm it down. When that was accomplished, only after a couple of years, then he was released. But you have to realize that no matter what he was called to do in the church, he did it. I never heard him complain, and for that matter, ever criticize anyone. It didn't matter if he was called to be ward clerk, scoutmaster, bishop, or custodian. He just performed the job the best he could. And there was a lot about his life that I'll never know, but I do know that one of those quiet, faithful men who was here in this life to serve the best he could and the best he knew how to do. I remember at his funeral service that Uncle Theo, one of his younger brothers, was asked to give the closing prayer. But I think we should have asked Theo to talk and give a talk about what he remembered Dad in his youth, because in his prayer it went on and on and on about all the times in Dad's life that most of us were not aware of, and nor were we ever more aware of if it had not been for that 10 or 15-minute prayer that Uncle Theo gave. One of Dad's passions toward the end of his life was building rocking chairs. He had them scattered throughout all the western United States, and they were made out of cedar trees. And like everything else he made, they were extremely well built. They were very heavy. They were made to last, I think, through the millennium. He made one for Stan and me, and then he gave one to all of his grandkids. What a dad and what a grandpa he was. He always wanted to go on a mission, but Mom would not go. So he became a temple initiatory worker in St. George Temple. He drove to St. George, Utah a couple of days of the week while Mom stayed home in Bunkerville, Nevada. And he loved to search out his ancestors. Now, a little bit about Bunkerville, Nevada. Edward Bunker had settled first in Santa Clara, Utah, and when that community was trying to establish the United Order, which only lasted a short time. Then he was called by President Brigham Young to try the United Order again south in the Virgin Valley. So in 1877, Edward Bunker, with a company of Utah Saints, established a small community along the side of the Virgin River in that small valley. The name was voted on, and the settlement became known as Bunkerville, named after Edward Bunker. The United Order again only survived for about 3 years until 1880, and then it was disbanded. I think it was mainly a struggle over the fights and water rights and everything else that the Saints couldn't handle with the United Order.
Chapter 1, Early Life. The first memory I had in Payson, we were living in Grandma and Grandpa Cappel's house at 109 North, 400 West. I remember Mom letting me swim in the big ditch out in front of the house. Mom would put me down in about 2 inches of water and let me splash around a bit. That was swimming in a big way for me. The house was a big 2-story old house right on the corner of the block with 2 big apple trees out front. I became more familiar with the house later in life when I bought the house from my parents when I joined the Utah Highway Patrol. As a little tyke, I had fond memories of our Saturday night baths in a number 10 wash tub. My brother Stan always got the bath first because he is the oldest. And so the water was not very clean or not very warm when it was my turn. That same number 10 wash tub was used for a bunch of things. On wash days, Mom and Grandma would wash their clothes in that tub with old scrub brushes and a scrub board. Then they'd hang clothes out to dry on a long, droopy clothesline. All the clothes were held up with wooden clothespins. As Stan and I grew older, those clothespins, which were held together by iron springs, turned into quite good little guns that we both would shoot matches. And when the matches were hit, that would light them up with the wire hitting them on the same pull of the trigger. As time progressed, the folks bought Stan a Red Ryder BB gun for Christmas. And then they had to take it away because we shot me in the bum with a BB that had to be dug out. Of course, there was a lot of tears, a lot of howling, and Stan and his friends were in trouble. They always had BB gun wars. Our rules were, or their rules were, you couldn't shoot above the waist. So I guess that's why he thought it was okay to shoot me in the bum. But then those wars were short-lived. Stan was 4 years older than me, so he would really get mad with me trailing him around wherever he went. Every time he wanted to go somewhere, I would always echo his request with, "Me too, me too." So he called me little Me Too and tried to sneak away without permission to play with his gang. Then my nickname soon was changed to Little Moses when one day I found myself backing up and falling in the good old number 10 wash tub full of water. I'm sure I was trying to get away from something that Stan was trying to do to me. There were many things about Grandma's that really endeared her to me. She would let me investigate her in her jewelry drawer. And as long as I didn't take anything, that is, I felt like I was on a real treasure hunt. Then were the many times that she would go to Salt Lake City to play the tabernacle organ. She was a very accomplished pianist and had a steady stream of piano students. And she was also a dyed-in-the-wool nutritionist and was always feeding me chive sandwich. But I rebelled when she decided she was going to make some chive ice cream. When I was very small, my dad bought a building lot just through the block from Grandma and Grandpa Capel. Back in those days, the railroad would replace the used ties on the train tracks and leave the old ties alongside of the track. They were free to anyone who wanted to pick them up and use them. So Dad decided he was going to build a house out of those old used railroad ties. It was to be built after the manner of a log cabin. He covered it with shingles, and it was very inexpensive. He poured a foundation after putting in the plumbing, and he had some of his brothers and friends and neighbors gather and stack those ties together. As the house took shape, Stan and I used to play down by the railroad tracks and watch the gathering progress. The tracks was a few blocks away from the house, and those tracks were not used much except to store old boxcars on. But we had a good time playing hide and seek in and out of those boxcars. I don't remember just how it came about, but one play day when Stan figured that he had about enough of Me Too following him around and his buddies around, he decided it would be an excellent idea to lock his little tag-along brother in one of those boxcars. So, by hook or crook, he got me to climb up into one of those boxcars. Then he and his friends rolled the big boxcar door closed and locked the hasp on the outside. Now, I really don't remember how dark it was inside of that car or how hot it got, but all I remember was at the setting of the sun, it really got dark, no matter how hard I beat on that door and how loud I cried. Well, nothing happened and nothing went my way. After hours of enduring the dark, the heat, and the panic of a little boy left to fend for himself, Stan showed up and said, Mom said I had to come and let you out. That seemed to be the relationship between a little brother and his big, bad brother. When the house finally got built, Dad found a job with one of his brothers in Idaho. I think it was a construction job, and it was in the winter time. So on Christmas Eve, Mom let us stay up and watch for Dad to come driving in. In those years, he drove an old square primer black Chevy. In fact, I think everyone that had a car at those times drove a primer black square, whatever kind of car. Anyway, Stan and I got to put our Red Ryder PJs on and watch out the front window for him to come. I remember how hard it was snowing. I was sure no one could make it through all the way from Idaho to Payson, Utah in a blizzard. Every car that turned our corner that night was a square, black primer painted car. Christmas Eve turned into Christmas morning. Before that old car, now covered with white snow, delivered our dad home. What a celebration we had. Tough times seemed to continue on during my growing up years. I remember one time that I'd saved all my pennies to buy something neat. One Saturday night when Dad was home, we all got in the old beater of a car and went to a little market on Payson Boulevard to buy a gallon of milk. As all the family looked around the store, I happened on a cool little paring knife, and it was only 10 cents. I showed it to Dad, then showed it to him my 10 pennies and told him I wanted to buy it. For some unknown reason, at least for a little boy, Dad said no. Well, I had scrimped and saved those 10 pennies. So I thought that I deserved the knife. When he wasn't looking, I sneaked it to the counter and bought the darn thing. That was a bad move. It was another of those clear, cold, blistery winter nights. I remember my conscience got the better of me, so I showed my knife to Mom and Dad. Another bad move. Dad pulled over in a snowbank, took the knife away from me, lectured me on minding my father, and then I cried all the way home. And I never saw that kitchen knife again. There were some really good memories in Payson, though. When the road really got snow-packed, Dad would let us hitch up our sleds to the back of his big black bomber, and he'd pull us all over town. And I thought that was really neat. Dad also let us raise rabbits. He built a rabbit pen so Stan and I would take turns feeding and watering them. Then they had so many babies. They were so cute, and those babies kept coming on and on all the time. I could never find out where they all came from, but I did find out where rabbits went and what they were good for. When they grew good and fat, Dad would butcher them. The first time that happened, I could not believe it. My dad could be so cruel, and it took me a while to get used to eating rabbit for supper. But sometimes that's all we had to eat. I remember we had a big chicken coop next door that had been abandoned about in the 1800s. It had a pretty good slope to the roof, so one day I decided it would make the most excellent side. I paid attention that the roof was made out of wood shingles, which looked almost like a cactus with all those ancient splitters sticking out in every direction. With hardly any urging at all from my big brother, I climbed to the peak of the roof and down I came. I really got going, and when I hit the eaves of the roof, I flew off into the air. And it was really cool. I landed in an old pile of chicken poop and didn't hurt at all until I got up and felt my pants sticking to my bum. With what had been embedded in it I thought was a 2x4. By the time I made it to the house, I realized that this would be another of those digging something out of Lyman's backside side again times. Even Dad couldn't get the timber out using needles and tweezers. So I had to go through the indignity of going to the doctor, having him oh and ooh about the size of the splinter as he numbed my bum and extracted it from my backside. I think Mom even kept it as a trophy. Such was some of my fond memories in Payson. Dad was always looking for work during those early years. After selling our little house in Payson, we moved to Bountiful so he could work with his brother Foss. Foss had done well in the real estate business. He had built a big apartment complex and was building homes at that time. For a couple of years, we lived in Uncle Foss's basement while my dad helped him out. I guess really Foss is helping us out. During that time, Stan and I would have to ride the bus a couple of miles to the grade school. We had to walk about a quarter of a mile to get to the bus stop through the Val Verde Arch. As we were freezing our tails off, Stan got one of his bright ideas one day. There was an old wagon wheel with a metal rim around it that someone had propped up by the telephone pole. I bet you can't lick the snow off that wheel, Stan said, and he was such a dork anyone could lick snow off the dumb old wagon wheel. Well, I'll give you a dime if you can do it. Now that piqued my interest. You lie. No, I promise I'll give you a dime. Well, what a dumb challenge. I straightforward went to the wheel, placed my tongue on the metal rim, and I was stuck. That wheel would not let go of my tongue. I turned and pulled, and all I did was get more frozen to that rim. The bus turned the corner and stopped at the bus stop. Help! I pleaded, help! Stan smiled and got on the bus, waved goodbye, and yelled back at me, see you after school. What a dork! I couldn't believe that he would go and do that to me and leave. I was in a panic by then and crying my eyes out. The school bus just drove away. I guess the bus driver didn't even see the situation that I was in. It was a long, long time before one of the kind mothers in the area happened to look out her window and took pity on me. With a pitcher of warm water, she rescued me from that traumatic predicament. Now, early years in Bunkerville. When we moved to Bunkerville, Nevada, my dad found an opportunity to go into the dairy business with an older fellow by the name of Washington Levitt. He had the money from the sale of our little house in Payson, Utah, so he bought about 50 head of Holstein cows. And we also invested in a small house that had about a half an acre that belonged to an old lady by the name of Annie Cox, and she had just barely passed away. His dad got a pretty good buy on the house and also the property. The house had only one bedroom and one bathroom and one kitchen. Dad had visions of doing some major remodeling jobs on the house, so he felt confident that this was the end of the rainbow. Now, he was half owner in a farm. He had a home to keep the rain off our heads, and he was set with his dream of living in a very small town with a future in the milking business, and so the dreams go. In 1952, the high school was held in Bunkerville, Nevada, and the grade school was in Mesquite. So Stan walked to the high school down the road, and I had to ride the bus to Mrs. Cox's third grade class in Mesquite, Nevada. It was during this period of my life that everything became hazy and it turned black. The ride to school was about 7 miles from the bus stop, and the kids that rode the bus were a menagerie of farm kids everywhere from Riverside to Bunkerville and the south end of Mesquite. To say that they were bullies would not do them justice. Every morning and every evening, en route to our little home, I would sneak to the back of the bus and play invisible. But of course, that didn't work. Not only were the most of the boys bullies, but the girls were almost as bad. If you haven't seen the show The War, you need to see it in order to appreciate the hand I had been dealt. You need to acquaint yourself with the Lipnicki kids. That is the Lipnicki kids. You will then get just an idea of what I was having to handle. I'm sure you've heard the story of dad that tells his son all you have to do is stand up and fight them, and that only works in the movies. It sure didn't work in the Virgin Valley. It was like living in a nightmare. To say the least, I was an unpopular kid. I wasn't even till I grew some muscles and hardened up my attitude and moved to high school in Bunkerville that I finally became accepted just a little bit, I guess. And over time, find friends that wouldn't beat me up to a pulp. I remember when I was a freshman, I had a couple of fights in the boys' locker room where I was finally able to convince one of the biggest bullies that I could take them in a fight. At least I found that in order to win and be accepted, I had to fight dirty. So I did, and they left me alone. Eventually, I got to the point that guys would include me in some of their shenanigans. Some of the more quiet boys really became my friend. I guess Mike White was my best friend. He was a year younger than me. He didn't start going to school and ride the bus for a year after I had arrived in Bunkerville. Then there was Ronnie Hardy, who finally got his dad to buy him a Harley Davidson motorcycle after I had bought mine from my brother Stan. Then there was Roger Bunker, who formed a trap line with me. Now he is a temple worker and a state patriarch in Mesquite. And there was Kenny Adams, my next door neighbor. You'll find out a lot more about these kids later in the story. Now back to my grade school years. During this time, I became a loner. The best times when I was alone, Dad taught me how to make figure 4 triggers for trapping. You could trap small animals without harming them, and it consisted of a trigger, a little bit of bait placed on a piece of screen underneath a box or a big bucket. The type of bait depended on what you're trying to catch. For chipmunks, quail, doves, and a few other small things, you could just use bread or grain. For rabbits and skunk, you could use some vegetables or whatever worked. I would check my figure 4 traps every morning and every evening. When the box or the bucket was tripped, it was laying flat on the sand covered screen when I checked it. I would slide my hand underneath the screen, turn the whole thing upside down so the screen then became the lid and you could see what you had captured. And hopefully it wouldn't be a skunk. And that's a whole nother story. I had to pause here, lest I forget this trapping story. When I was about 12 or 13, I caught a chipmunk in my figure 4 trap, and I previously picked up a bird cage from somewhere, and I was bound and determined to make a pat of that little varmint. The problem was transferring it from the closed lid bucket to the bird cage. Well, Dad happened to be working out in his big tin garage that day, making cupboards for some lady, and I figured that all I had to do was find one of his big leather gloves and gently put the chipmunk from the trap to the cage. Easy, huh? No, I found out it wasn't going to happen that way. Dad caught me looking through the cupboards and said, "What you doing?" "I'm hunting for a pair of gloves, Dad." "Why?" "Got a chipmunk and I'm going to put it in my bird cage." He knew very well what I was doing. "You don't need gloves to do that, you know." "Yes, I do. They'll bite your finger off, and if you don't have gloves, you'll have all heck to pay." "Ah, all you have to do is know how to catch the little bugger," my dad said. "You just use your thumb and your forefinger." And he held them out, his forefinger and his thumb, like he was going to catch a little rodent. "And then you have to catch them behind the neck, and then you have them." "Dad, they're too fast for you." "No, you just have to know how to do it. You have to be fast enough." Now, I knew that I was faster than my dad, and I wasn't about to try catching the little varmint behind the neck. "He's going to bite you, Dad." "Well, just watch and learn," Dad said, as he picked up the corner of the screen lid. By the time the little rodent was running around, and around the bottom of the bucket in a panic mode. "Now just watch, son, just watch here." He showed me his thumb and forefinger again in a pinching mood. He slowly put his hand into the bucket. Then, with a lightning fast movement that was hard to follow, he grabbed for the chipmunk's neck. I'd never seen my dad move so fast, but even faster, he jerked his hand from the bucket with the chipmunk attached to his forefinger. The blood was spurting around the shop as he flung it back and forth, trying to get the chipmunk to let loose. I didn't know if I'd ever witnessed a chipmunk bite a finger with such great force, and it wouldn't let go. Well, that was the first time I ever heard my dad swear. "Shit!" he yelled. With one last great swing, he flipped the chipmunk, and it flew through the air and hit the side of the tin shed, and it disappeared into nothingness. I really don't know where the thing went, but all I remember was it just went. I think of all the alternative universes, and it must be another place and another time. With blood spurting from the badly abused finger, he quietly went into the house. We never spoke of that incident again, and he never volunteered to pull one of my catches out of the trap again. So, as time went on, I grew a little bit bigger. Dad would have me and Stan help him down on the farm with the milking and the cows and such. There was feeding, pitching hay, cleaning out the barn, shoveling the cow crap, well, everything you do around a dairy farm. When the power would go off, Dad would get us up early in the morning, and we had to help milk cows by hand. And that was when the power was off. We had about 60 to 70 head every time the power was gone that we had to milk. By the unearthly time that we got them all milked, our forearms would get so tight that we couldn't even form a fist. When they finally allowed us to sleep that night, if the electricity came back on, it became a case of trying to do the impossible. Who could sleep with arms all tied up with Charlie horses? I came to hate and to love that farm, but I swore that I would never ever become a dairy farmer.
Your work is never done. Every night, every morning, you milk the cows 7 days a week, never a day off. That was just the tip of the iceberg. There was planting, watering, cutting, baling, hauling, stacking, and finally feeding the hay. And that's just dealing with the hay. Then there are 10 million other jobs to do on this kind of a farm. Suffice it to say that Glenn R. Peterson Dairy Farm didn't work out. I won't go all into all that happened, but his partner cheated Dad out of all the money. The payments that were supposed to be going to the bank were pocketed by this man. When Dad found out about it, it was too late to save the farm. The bank foreclosed, gathered up all the stock, including the horses. I love those horses. And took all the equipment. Our little farm was family was jobless, with nothing to show for the venture. We had nothing but a mortgage on our little home. But Dad did what he had to do. He started to work as a carpenter in Las Vegas, which was 80 miles away. He soon found that other guys around the area had made the 160 miles round trip each day, and they all shared expenses. I could not believe that my dad later on became the home teacher to the man who was responsible for the failure of our dairy business. I was Dad's home teaching companion at that time, and I asked him how he could forgive such a person. He just said, "You forgive and you forget, and that's all." I guess that was a good lesson, huh? Now, back to my childhood, or shall I say to my growing up years. There was a lot of things that I had to learn about living in Bunkerville. Even though we weren't related to any of the people in Bunkerville, I soon was calling everyone aunt or uncle. All the kids called all the old people aunt or uncle because all the children were related and all the adults in some way or other were related also. Another early memory of riding the bus mesquite was the time I found a black and white milk snake out behind the shop one night and I hid it until the morning. Before I got on the bus, I wrapped the snake around my belly under my shirt. When all was aboard, I took the snake out and proceeded to share my prize with all of the kids. I couldn't believe it. Just about everyone, even the boys, yelled and screamed and wouldn't touch me and touch my new pet. The bus driver finally pulled over to the side of the road and had me turn my small snake loose. I couldn't understand what the problem was. And I couldn't understand how many of the boys became my friend after that. Now, the principal of the school was my sixth grade school teacher. I remember him as a tall, skinny man by the last name of Harms. I really think he did not like me. It was a time in my memory that the military was testing the A bomb out on the test range out west of Las Vegas, Nevada. And the teachers would give us little pieces of smoked glass and let us stand outside the school to watch the explosion and the mushroom cloud that came about each time there was an explosion. So during that time, Mr. Harms and I got interested in flying saucers, UFOs. Mr. Harms would buy a paperback book on the subject and read them in the class, a chapter each day, until he finished the book. Well, just before the sixth grade graduation, Mr. Harms started a small paperback UFO book. He said he'd give it to me after he finished reading it to the class. Well, that was good and that was bad. I didn't want to hear the book read because I wanted to enjoy it all on my own.
So I sat back in the back of the classroom, put my fingers in my ears, and that seemed to be all right with Mr. Harms, but I could still hear a little of what he was reading. So I started to rub my elbows on my wooden desk. I would close my eyes, rub my elbows, and that seemed to work pretty good for me. But I soon had a strange feeling that the room had become quiet except for the noise of my rubbing elbows back and forth. I slowly opened my eyes, and there, standing above me, like he was a 10-foot tall alien, was Mr. Harms. Just what are you doing? Well, nothing. You seem to be making a lot of noise for doing nothing. Well, I didn't want to hear the book until I read it. And you didn't want anyone else to hear it, did you? No, that's okay, just me. Why don't you go out into the hall until everyone else is finished hearing it then? Okay? You still going to give me the book, though? Oh, we'll see. I decided to not press the point. So out in the hall I went. It was kind of funny. No one came out to get me after the reading was done until the bell rang to go home. Boy, that didn't figure. I didn't know why. Time soonly came for a graduation from the 6th grade. We didn't really have a graduation as such. Mr. Harm just passed out all of our report cards on the last day of school. Of course, he had to give his little lecture first. Now, he said, we'll pass out all the report cards. If there is anyone that does not receive a report card, that means you failed to pass, and you will have to spend the next year in the 6th grade again. Are there any questions? Well, there wasn't any questions. The cards were passed out. Mr. Harms called each name. The student went timidly up to his desk in front of the whole class. In front of the whole class, with everybody just oogling them, it seemed like time slowed down to nothing. Cards continued to be read off, names called. No Lyman. He didn't call Lyman. Finally, Mr. Harms announced, well, that's it. There was no Lyman called. Everyone knew that I did not receive my report card. There was not a sound in the classroom. Well, let's see. Did everyone get a report card? I was not going to say nothing. Well, good. It seems like everybody passed then. I still was not going to say nothing. He darn well know that he hadn't given me a report card. I was just about in tears, but I still wasn't going to say nothing. This was beyond embarrassing. I knew that I was one of the smartest kids in the 6th grade. Well, at least I thought I was. How could this happen to me? It was because of that book deal, because of that UFA book deal. I spent my time out in the hall, and now I would not let him win. I would not be embarrassed to myself. Lyman! What? Did you get a report card? Not a word was spoken. Lyman, did you receive a report card? I tried to wait him out. Lyman, yeah, a card? I would not cry in front of the whole class. But finally, no. Then why don't you come up here and get your card? I had made it. What a dork Mr. Harm was. Gathering all the bravado I could muster up, I sauntered up in front of the class. Could I please have the UFO book too? He handed me the card and the book, and he was still a dork. I could never, from then on, find a place in my heart to really forgive Mr. Harms. Then it was summer before I entered the high school when Dad gave me a .22 rifle. Now I could go hunting for sure. Before the 22, I had my flipper, and I was pretty good with it. Then I bought a BB gun, and I was even better with it. Because BB gun in hand, when twilight came to the evening, I would go out to a big cottonwood tree just across the street from our house. One of the few street lights in Bunkerville was right beside that tree, and the sparrows would start to gather around about the same time each night. That's when I really became active with my BB gun. There was a bunch of feral cats that would come and sit underneath the tree and wait for the supper. I got so I could hit sparrows long after dark. From the light of their lamp posts, I could see the birds move and flitter around from branch to branch. So I shot at the fluttering movements. One night I counted 50 birds that fell from the tree, and I think by that time I went to the house, there were 25 cats that had a good meal for that night. But now with my 22, I was ready for big game. I started to hunt pheasants, cottontail, quail, chuckers, and a bunch of small animals. In Bunkerville, I think they had a lot of animals. I don't think any of us kids even considered getting a hunting license, though. We just kept hunting. One day, that all changed. I spotted some pheasants in the hay patch just north of the house the night before on a Saturday night. You have to realize I pretty well kept my folks in meat with my small game that I shot. That was after I received my 22, so I was always on the lookout. Now, it was Friday night, actually, that I saw the pheasant, so I got up early Saturday morning and made my way down to the hayfield. I quietly sneaked up on some pheasants, and I popped a good fat rooster. About that time, I heard a small plane landing in the field right beside me. I had been so intent on hunting, I hadn't heard the plane until it landed. As it touched down, I saw that it was a fish and game plane, which would have cops that were spotting violators as it flew around. I thought that I'd had it for sure. So I grabbed the pheasant and took off running. I headed north toward the Virgin River. After crossing a couple of hayfields, I heard the rangers still hot on my trail. I figured that my only escape was to lose them in the dense scrub around the river, and I also knew some good trails through the dense mesquite bush and the river willows. One of those routes was would cross the old diversion dam that had been abandoned and grown over years ago. The dam had been built out of rock and reinforced with heavy wire fencing, and it had a flat top. Well, with the rangers breathing down my neck, I buried my old 22 in the sand on the far side of the dam, climbed up on the flat top, and continued to run toward the river. I did manage to fling the evidence, the pheasant, off into the brush as I ran. I don't think the cops found my dam or any of the animal trails to the river because I could hear them cussing and trampling and losing a lot of headway as they tried to catch up to me. I hit the river running and went west, finding good footing on the hard packed sand. And I knew that I was leaving some easily forward tracks, but I had a plan in mind. About a mile to the west of town, there were a series of duck ponds that the farmers had hollowed out with a D9 Caterpillar. I knew these ponds well because Roger Bunker and I had set muskrat traps in them. I guess there were 3 or 4 ponds, and they were pretty big, and they were surrounded with cattails and all kinds of water reeds. So I headed down the river to a place that I knew that was just adjacent to the ponds. I back then to the south and found myself in the safety of familiar ground. I think by then, adrenaline was pumping more in my body than sweat was flowing like rivers down the outside of me. For about an hour, I stayed by the safety of the biggest pond listening for the rangers. I had it all planned out. I'd found a long, hollow reed, like a long, hollow straw, and I practiced breathing through it. It worked really good. I finally became aware of a trampling through the brush coming toward me. The rangers had followed me. They had followed my footprints. I knew it. I silently slipped down into the mossy water that branched off into a shallow part of the pond. I lay on my back, stuck in the mud about 2 feet underwater, and breathed through the reed. It seemed like hours went by. When I carefully raised my head above the moss and listened, I realized that some kids had come down to the ponds to play and were making a lot of noise. But I could not discount the fact that the cops could be part of the noise, searching for the little lawbreaker. I stayed in that pond all day long, at times submerging and breathing through the reed, at other times just listening. Well, it was after dark when I made my way home. Smelling like a dead muskrat, I stripped naked outside of the back door, sneaked into the bathroom, and took a long, hot bath. I don't remember why I wasn't found out by my folks. They must have gone to town or something happened. Probably they went to Mesquite and jail Boulder store to go groceries. But that's how we lived back in Bunkerville at that time. The next day, being Sunday, I of course went to church. After church and after we ate supper, I changed my church clothes, got into some dry grubbies, and made my way down to the dam and unburied my .22 rifle. That night, I spent a lot of time cleaning and oiling the gun parts. And as I think about it, that .22 is now in the possession of Adam, one of my sons, and I think another son, Duke, broke the bolt off of it, and Adam had a blacksmith fix it. It was the best gun of all the guns I ever owned. There are so many stories flying through my brain. I guess I'll have to just relay the best of them, or the story of my life will never end, and maybe that would be a good thing. Maybe I would live to the millennium. The next story comes to mind, has to do with trying to steal apples. I really didn't think that I did that. Of course not. I have to say in my defense that we did try, but we were unable to obtain our objective. There was me, Mike Waite, Kenny Adams, and Richard Price. We happened to be out front of our house one October day, and I think it was around noonish, and we were looking across the road at the Whitwer apple trees. Now, the Whitwer place was really an old place. It consisted of an original house that was built by the first pioneers when they entered the valley. There was an ancient barn and outbuildings, and then right by the only apple tree where the apples were ripe and ready to pick was an old outhouse. There were about 40 acres of fields to go along with all of the Whitwer buildings. Our problem that we never thought of was just why we didn't just ask Uncle Harmon Whitwer for the apples. He probably would have said yes. But then he was about 100 years old, really, and probably wouldn't hear us knock on his door if we would have thought of it. But he had this really weird son by the name of Ellis. Ellis was about 50 years old and had never been married. No kidding. He was more than a half of a bubble off center. He never came to church, and you could only find him if you really searched for him. He would be lurking around the buildings and hedgerows of his dad's property. I guess you could say that he was just a little scary, at least scary to a bunch of little kids. I think at the time we were about 10 or 12 years old. Previous to this incident, just 2 lots away from Uncle Harmon's, running alongside of the only paved road in Bunkerville, there's a field of rabbit brush. The whole acre of brush had to be about 10 feet high and was so thick it was even hard for rabbits to wend their way through it. But we, right in the middle of it, made our fort. And we had wended our way into the very center and hacked and tramped out the neatest clubhouse that you'd ever seen. We even adorned it with apple crates for tables and old stumps for chairs and all sorts of small treasures that kids collect and want to hide from other kids, like pieces of full gold and yo-yos with broken strings and broken pocket knives and old yellow candles made of homemade yellow wax and things like that. When it got tough going for us, we would call a meeting and solve our problems, going to our clubhouse. Now, I'm just telling you about our clubhouse because it becomes an integral part of the story, and so does Richard Price and his home. Richard's house happened to sit on the hill right behind Kenny Adams' house. His house was another of those adobe structures built with the original influx of the pioneers, and it was falling apart, to say the least. Now back to the story. The stage was set, the decision made. We were not going to let all those apples hung so ripe and so good to eat. We were not going to let them go to waste, so we formed a plan. We would go down the lane that ran 2 fields east of the Whitworth fields and go almost to the Virgin River, then double back, sneaking up the hedgerows that encircled each of the 20-acre fields until we reached the bottom of the Whitworth field. At that time, we would wait and reconnoiter, watch the house and the outbuildings to make sure that Ellis was not lurking around anywhere. But we realized that Ellis was a sneaky four. Well, I guess he was a sneaky foe, too. He might even crawl through the hayfield and get to us if he saw us. When we finally arrived at the hedgerow at the bottom of the Whitworth field, we waited and we watched. We had been so sneaky along the fence line, and we were positive that Ellis could not have seen us. We were ready. I was the first over the fence, and I moved almost unseen with unseen grace. Then came Mike Waite and then Kenny Adams, and last, here came Richard Price. With the outmost of stealth, we started across the open field. The selected apple tree was right at the far end, surrounded by a new grove of hay. I watched everywhere at once, not missing anything. There was no movement. As we approached the tree, my view became riveted on the outhouse. I was sure that I saw something move. I stopped. We all stopped. With the sight of a hawk in search of evening meal, I saw a movement again, and I appeared along the side of the leaning, weathered outhouse. Of course it was Ellis. I let out a yell in panic at the others. It's Ellis! It's Ellis! Well, Kenny, then Mike, and I ran for the back fence. However, Richard was of the opinion that we were just trying to jerk on his chain. I caught up and passed Mike and Kenny and was on the one leading the flight. Ellis came out from behind the outhouse with fire in his eyes and death in his muddled mind. He would kill us all if he caught us. Richard, run! I turned my head and looked back to see him slowly loping along, not realizing Ella was hot on his tail and ready to catch him in a second. I saw Richard look back. I'd never seen such a burst of speed like I saw that day. At that instant, Richard first passed Mike, then Kenny, and before I hit the hedgerow fence, Richard flew by me, vaulted over the fence, over the hedgerow, and left us in the dust. The rest of us followed suit. We looked back and we thought that we'd be secure on the far side of the fence, but on came Ellis. The fence or the hedgerow did not slow him down in the least. To the clubhouse, I screamed. We were dead meat. We quickly changed our direction like a flock of geese following the one gimpy goose in the lead, which would have been now Richard Price. I mean, he really flew. I do not think his feet touched the ground until he dove into the hidden entrance to the fort. By then we had all gained a little on him, and he was crawling through the rabbit brush. We were pushing him forward toward the center, toward the fort, the clubhouse, toward safety. We reached the center of the mass of the brush and laid in the dirt, trying to catch our breath. Things calmed down for a few seconds. Even though it was fall and not hot at all, we were all red-faced and about ready to faint with an unearthly amount of energy that we had expended. All quieted down. We all tried to hold our breaths and listen. We were sure we lost him, and we were safe. Then we heard the breaking and smashing of the rabbit brush. He could not find us, could he? Good heavens, the brush covered at least 2 acres, and it was so thick it took us a month to make the tunnel to the center of it, to our fort, by smashing through the destruction. And he wasn't even trying to follow our tunnel or the trail that we had made. He was making his own. It was unbelievable. It was a nightmare. We were dead. Fortunately, several weeks prior to the death run on the apple tree, we had voted to make a smaller, more hidden back door out of the clubhouse. And by this time, we decided it was an appropriate time to vacate the security of our fort. That was what we had come to consider our clubhouse, a place that would protect us from the wickedness of one Ellis Whitworth. The security of the fort had finally fallen to the wayside. We had become casualties of war if we stayed, so we evacuated. Richard, who was still leading us, choked in a voice that was totally unfamiliar to us. My mom, she's not home. Head there, lock the doors. We headed up the hill. As we topped the hill and looked back toward the brush, we saw Ellis finally emerging on the run. Could he run off after that? Well, he saw us. He saw us and started running toward us. We were blocks away. I could plainly see the recognition in his eyes as he saw us, and he was on his way. We pulled down the shades and locked the doors when we got into the house. He's coming. He'll kill us. Into the closet, Richard yelled. The closet was small and it was hot. It wasn't meant to hold 4 sweaty, dirty urchins. Luckily, the door swung inward, and there was not any clothes hanging in it, thank goodness. We pried the rod that was supposed to hang the clothes on from somewhere over our heads and propped it up against the door. We wondered if that would stop him. This was the last line of defense. The outside doors began to rattle as our nemesis tried to reach one of them and found that they were locked. And then, unbelievable, he started to try the windows. We had forgotten to check the locks on the windows. I didn't even think that there were any window locks anyway. It was such an old house. The rattle continued all around the house. Then, all of a sudden, it became quiet, an unearthly quietness. It stretched on for hours. It stretched on for eternities. We knew that this was a ploy of his. He'd wait us out. He would stay outside until either we died or gave up. We watched the sunlight at the crack of the bottom of the door fade and go out as the sun set outside our self-made prison. We would sleep there, standing up if we had to. Then an outside door creaked open. We didn't breathe. Lights came on in rooms that we had vacated. The closet door shook. We were dead. The door shook again and tried to bow inwards. The bar held. Richard! Richard, you in there? It was his mom. Richard! Mom! What in the name of heavens are you doing? We took the bar off the door and timidly opened it. What are all of you doing in there? Good heavens! I would like an explanation. Nothing honest, Mom. We were just scared to death when it got dark and this old house started to make all those noises. She looked at each of us in turn and didn't say a word about our dirty, sweaty bodies or all the scratches and torn clothes that hung from us. I am sure she really didn't want to know the whole story and what we had been up to. So she very quietly just said, "It's time for your boys to go home." And that incident became the story that we did not tell to anyone. Chapter 2, High School in Bunkerville, Nevada. Now the time really began. The following story will not be in sequential order. They all happened while I was attending high school, between 12 to 17 years old. I don't know why, but we spent 6 years in high school. So when we became freshmen in the 7th grade. When the new freshman class started in school in Bunkerville, not only was there a special assembly put on by the mighty seniors, but there was also a hazing practice for all of the freshman boys. During the first week, all of the new boys were caught by the older boys and pantsed. That means that their pants were pulled down or off, if possible, in front of a bunch of girls. It was an unwritten law from somewhere, sometime in the hazy past, that this must happen. All the freshman boys had to go through this indignity. The week started with the freshman boys, one by one, on a regular basis, having their pants jerked down. The senior boys were found on every break, especially after school, sitting on top of an old school pipe fence, just waiting for us, watching for us. For us freshman boys, they reminded me of a bunch of vultures waiting for a kill and just looking for a chance to descend on the carrion. The last hazing day of the week. All of the freshman boys had been pantsed by the end of the week, except for Roger Bunker and me. On Friday, Roger and I had predetermined to meet and sneak away to his house, which is only a block away from the schoolhouse. As we came out of the school, the boys, the senior boys, were all lined up sitting on top of the pipe fence. We were the only two left. We were the only two that had not been passed. We made our way quickly to the other side of the road, walking toward Roger's house. As the boys started their cat calls, I whispered, "Don't look at them." "Hey, come over here. We need to ask you something." "Don't say nothing, Roger," I pleaded with him. "Hey, come over here." "You just keep walking, Roger." Finally, we got a little bit past them, and Roger turned toward the guys on the fence and said, "Piss on you." That did it. The fence emptied. I headed for Roger's house, and I'm sure Roger thought he could outrun all of the seniors. He was the fastest one in our class, so he headed for the hay fields down toward the duck ponds. That morning, I had put on my shark skin cowboy boots that I had ordered from Sears and Roebuck. The boots really slowed me down. About half of the seniors caught up with me on the front porch of Roger's house. Half the seniors, they couldn't get my pants down over my boots. In the process, I made so much noise hollering and cussing that finally Roger's mom came out of the house and saved my bacon. Roger, though, was not so lucky. He got caught in the middle of the first hay field. The gang pantsed him, and then his pants ended up on the school flagpole. One of the seniors cut the rope that was used to hoist the flag up, and as a result, those pants stayed up on the pole for a whole week. The next week was a conclusion of the initiation, as Roger's pants flew high in the place of honor. The seniors all got to pick one of us, freshmen, out of all of the mix and have us dress in a certain way for the assembly that would happen on Friday afternoon. They also penned a poem which we all, as freshmen, had to kneel before them every time a senior came by. Well, my costume consisted of a girl's bathing suit, a woman's hat, and high heels, and I thought, well, I did make a pretty good-looking girl. That Friday ended the hazing with an assembly. The freshmen had to sit in front of all the school in all of our costumes, on the stage, in the assembly room. The initiatory started with one of the seniors coming on stage with a bedpan filled with apple juice. Well, we thought it was filled with apple juice, and I guess floating in the juice was a Baby Ruth candy bar. Well, by this time you read this book, if Baby Ruth candy bars have become extinct, I'm going to describe it. A Baby Ruth candy bar is caramel, then covered with chocolate and nuts, and round and oblong bar that looks like if you might have come out of somebody's toilet. The seniors rocked in front of his chosen unfortunate lowly freshman with a loud booming voice announced so the assembly all could hear it. "Eat it." My classmate took one look into that pan, then promptly knocked it to the stage floor and the area with the apple juice, and that big brown whatchamacallit came floating after it. That started the assembly off, and it went downhill from that point on. I will not attempt to proliferate on the stories that happened during and directly relate the 6 years of Virgin Valley's high school. I guess I should start with the skunk stories. There were quite a lot of skunk stories, you know. Now on with my skunk story. Well, you know that the kids in Mesquite called Bunkerville Skunkerville, and so you know why. We had a lot of skunks. It seems like there's about 2 feet of crawl space under the building that contained the auditorium. The art class and the shop class and the FFA room in the high school, it was all underneath about 2 feet. One of us got the idea that if a skunk were to get trapped in that crawl space for a period of time, it'd probably create such a stink that the principal would have to let school out. Well, of course, somebody continued on with the idea. So one Friday, we found a small skunk, put it into one of the entries of under the crawl space, and then we boarded it up. Then we proceeded around to the other 3 openings that went underneath the school and boarded them up too. Also, well, nothing happened the next morning. No smell, no nothing. So one of the kids suggested that the tomcats and skunks hated each other and would fight to the death. Well, that precipitated we finding a feral cat. I don't know if it was a tom or not, but we opened up one of the coverings, stuck the cat in, and boarded it up again and left. I guess that idea was pretty good because Monday morning, as we arrived at school, the teachers were standing outside. They reported that a skunk had evidently crawled under the building and died. One of the guys unobtrusively went around to all the coverings and pulled them off and did away with them. As far as we were concerned, the story ended there. It happened on a Monday and the school was dismissed until the next Thursday. But it still smelled like that for weeks, and I don't know who went under the school for the dead skunk. But all I know was we were not caught and we had extra days off from school. Boy, you never know. Another skunk story. One of the older boys got the idea that it'd really be neat if someone would get a little baby skunk and put it in the art teacher's big desk drawer. I don't think I was a part of this prank. All I know was the art teacher, his name was Mr. Koalas, did find the skunk in his drawer that on Monday morning. This happened about a year after the skunk incident underneath the high school. And he had to go home, change his clothes, and we did not get out of school that day, and I never smelled anything because this is just a third-party account of all the doings. Now, skunk story number 3. Of course, the dramas that I was involved in turned out to be the best. I think they got better and better over the years. Mr. Cameron, who was the biology teacher, had a standing order of anyone that caught a baby skunk, he wanted to descend it. Well, on one Saturday morning, I did catch a really small baby skunk in my figure 4 trap and was able to transfer it to my wonderful bird cage, and it didn't spray me. I couldn't believe it. In fact, I played with it until I had a false sense of confidence that it was not going to spray. Well, as usual, I was wrong about that one too. Next morning, it being Sunday, Mr. Cameron was a member of the bishopric. So that day I told him about my catch, and he was really excited. He told me that after Bishop's meeting, he wanted me to bring the skunk over to him. So I watched out my window, and when Mr. Cameron, who lived right next door to us, came home from church, when he drove up in his car with his Sunday suit on, I was out the front door with my little bird cage and
went over to his home before he could even open up his car door. As I walked up to the front porch, he took the cage from me and admired the little black and white spotted skunk. It was no bigger than a small guinea pig, or maybe even a little bit smaller, but it looked so cute and so defenseless. I think that Mr. Cameron thought he could just pick it up out of the cage and take it into the house, especially after I had told him that I'd played with it for quite a while. He opened up the cage door, put his hand inside, and the little helpless skunk was so terrified that he slipped out between the bars in the back of the bird cage. I couldn't believe it, right through the bird cage bars. Unbelievable. In front of Mr. Cameron's house at that time, there stood a huge cottonwood tree, and up the tree climbed that little skunk with Mr. Cameron right behind it, bound and determined to catch the little escapee. As he reached for the small escapee, it let loose a spray of unbelievable smell. Mr. Cameron was saturated with a suit spoiling fragrance. The chase was immediately forgotten. Mr. Cameron retired to the safety of his home. Now, you have to realize this. His little house was fitted with a clothesline on a pulley that went from the sink area in the kitchen, and it was an ingenious fixed line that pulled the clothes outside the house to dry. Next thing I saw was the kitchen window came open, and out came the suit and the pants and the socks and the shoes, and last of all came the long-handled single-piece underwear. 2 days later, all the skunk sprayed items were put into the flame of a 50-gallon burn can. We'll never know what happened to the small skunk. Well, if it could be escaped from between the bars of the bird cage, it most certainly could escape from the heights of the cottonwood tree. And like we say all the time, well, yeah, skunk don't think, don't stink, do they? Well, let me tell you this about that. It ain't true. About 2 blocks above our home was what we called the Big Ditch. The first years that we lived in Bunkerville, it was just a huge canal dug out of dirt, and later the town council had it all cemented in. As I got older, I'd hire out in the summertime to the water district at $1 an hour to clean out the mud and that filled the ditch in the winter months. The canal was the source of water for the farmers and their crops. Early in the history of Bunkerville, the pioneers dug huge cisterns that used ditch water to drink. They would fill them up and let the mud settle out and have a pretty good source of water for culinary purposes, both with their animals and for their household needs. As time went on, they cemented these cisterns, and they were cleaned out once a year, shoveling out the mud at the bottom and hauling in its topside with a bucket and a pulley. About 5 miles above town, along the side of the river, there was a sand gate. It served a way to eliminate some of the sand and muddy water diverted from the Virgin River. By 1952, when we arrived in the valley, the Pioneer Dam in the river had been reinforced from rock and brush dam. It seemed like it washed out about every spring during the spring runoff, to a dam made of old junker cars, rock cement, trees, limbs, even some updated every 4 or 5 years. They would have to bring in other things because it'd all wash out, and the town would gather together to build it up again. Water was a big thing in Bunkerville. It seemed like some of the farmers were always taking their water turns a little early or robbing the water rights from other farmers. I remember one time in a priesthood meeting on Sunday morning, there arose such a verbal argument about a water turn that one old feller invited another farmer out into the street to settle the argument. The bishop had to step in and calm things down before it came to physical violence. It seems that we were either had too little water or too much water. Either was flooding and washing everything out, or the water was so low in the big ditch you couldn't have much water. In the summer, I remember that the water got so hot that it killed all the catfish that run up in the big ditch. And they came floating down the ditch and when you watered out the fields. One time we had such a hard rain in the mountains that some of us kids were sent up into the sandhills above town to watch for the floodwaters. Sure enough, we were able to watch the water start with a trickle first, and then it became a raging flood. One of our neighbors had a D9 cat and was able to divert most of the flood from above our house and his house. But it still filled the floor of our house with mud, and so we had to shovel it out. Speaking of floods, I guess I have to tell you a story now before it slips out on my memory. One spring, when me and Mike White were probably about 13 or 14 years old, there was a especially big flood in the Virgin River. It washed out the diversion dam above town and carried big trees down with it, and it was right to the bottom of the road that and the bridge that ran over from Bunkerville to Mesquite. I guess again, I think we were about 15 years old. Mike White was about 14, but we had our heads that this was the flood that we'd been waiting for. We got some big truck inner tubes and rode them from Mesquite and Bunkerville Bridge on Old Highway down 91 to the bridge 7 miles to the west at Riverside, Nevada. At the time, consisted of a rundown old motel, Riverside did, and the freeway I-15 did not exist at that time. The main old highway 91 ran by Bunkerville through Riverside, then up over Mormon Mesa and on to Las Vegas. Well, this was a brilliant idea that had been forming in our small farm boy type minds for years, it seemed. I have to admit that the flood stage of the river, the destruction that had already been done, the fact that we would be killed by one of the big cottonwood trees that had been knocked down and were everywhere evident in those muddy waters had not even entered into our little heads. Somehow, though, we convinced our dads that the idea of riding the river was a cool thing to do. With the truck tire inner tubes, we'd be just fine. Our mothers never agreed with that assessment, but our father, being the head of the family and the priesthood holder, we seemed to triumph. Next Saturday, with my dad and both of our mothers watching, we launched our tubes into the flood. As the bridge receded from our view, the folks yelling and waving at us, we disappeared around the bend in the river, and it became evident this expedition was a big mistake. As we bobbed along in the muddy water, our eyes soon filled with mud, mainly sand, and stinking silt-ridden water. I really didn't think you could call it water. It was more like a big, muddy, driven goop that even clogged our noses to the point that we could not breathe. That sludge took us to the heights that would not top out, and then it would suck us down into the rocky, sandy river bottom and threaten to pull our tubes out from under our bottoms. Then, just as fast, with more force than you can even imagine, it would top us out again. Another thing that was overwhelming was the size of the cottonwood trees that threatened to pulverize us into little bitty pieces. I could not believe our tubes would get punctured by a limb or something, or some unseen slimy thing that was constantly bumping into us that we didn't even know. In a very short time, I was yelling at Mike, and he was yelling back at me, and that we should abandon our adventure and leave the river if that was even possible by then. Well, we decided to make our way to the southern bank, the bank of where old 91 ran, and hike up to the road, but it was easier said than done. The river kept sucking us back into the main channel, and no matter how hard we fought it, it wouldn't let us go. About a mile went by, but it seemed like 1,000 miles, and we couldn't fight our way out. Another mile went by. You realize it was 7 miles from one bridge to the next bridge on the muddy river. We were going to die. I knew we were going to die. Unbeknownst to me and Mike, both of our moms, patiently waiting, became very aggravated at my dad. And although he was the only man to take out their vengeance on, to a point of verbally, viciously accusing him of bringing about the deaths of their two precious boys. Almost an hour passed, and it had become very apparent that the boys were not going to show. With a calm and broken voice, my dad assured the women folks that perhaps the boys had realized the force of the flood and were at this moment walking down the road toward them. So Dad left the women to watch the river while he headed back up to Bunkerville in his car. A couple of miles up the road, he came upon two chocolate-covered young men with swollen eyes from the sand and the crud, gingerly rolling two huge inner tube truck tires down the road. When we were reunited with their mothers, they were in tears and so happy to see us that we didn't get near the tongue lashing that my dad got. While I'm on the water issue now, I might as well tell you about the falls, our swimming hole. And more than a swimming hole, it was a big ditch. The falls were left over a result of an old flour mill that the pioneers had built to grind out their wheat into flour. Originally, it consisted of a huge water wheel that turned in the grinding stone, which pulverized the wheat into flour. As the flour became cheaper and more available, the mill was disassembled until all that was left was a wooden flume and a big hole where the flume made, which we called the falls. This flume poured the ditch water over about a 10-foot fall below into the big pond. It was like a waterfall-fed swimming pool coming from the river itself, pounding into the swimming hole. It then continued on down the ditch to water some farmer's field, but it sure made a good swimming pool for the kids. I think that the pond was about 10 feet deep in the middle and covered a circumference of about a half of an acre. Well, it was really cool, huh? Sometimes I would get into the big ditch above our house and swim or float about a mile down to the falls, and many times us boys would play head tag most of all day, especially in the summertime when the temperature was above 100 degrees, which most of the times was all summer long. Head tag consisted of with one kid being it, and he had to catch and hold another kid above water, at least his head was above water, to rub his head, and then the victim became it. It could be a very rough game. As hours passed by and the temperature of the water became hotter, the game became more and more aggressive. I remember as the farmers' watermelon crops also became ripe, it was as it cooled off at night, the skunks would come into the patches and break open the melons and eat the hearts out of them. The hearts of the melon is the sweetest part, and that was at that time we didn't have seedless watermelons. So anyway, some of us boys got our shotguns and 22s and decided to go skunk hunting. Of course, a couple of hours of shooting skunks, we tended to smell more like the skunks than the skunk smelled like the skunks. So off we'd go down to the falls and we'd swim all night long. When we retrieved our clothes in the morning, of course, we had to skinny dip because of the smell our clothes had. We would sneak home, burn the grubbies that we had worn, and then we would take tomato juice baths to go to bed. And it was pretty cool, though, we thought as kids. On with the water stories. The 3rd of July was a special day for us in Bunkerville. Our folks would let us stay up all night long. I guess it was a sleepover type thing. No one ever slept. All year long we anticipated this event. We'd have water fights all night long. First we'd have to act like it was a sleepover, of course. We would get our blankets and our pillows and usually lay them out on Mike Waite's front lawn. Then we would retrieve the buckets that we had gathered together and turn on the hose at the corner of his lawn and fill the buckets with, and the war would really begin. By midnight, there would be 5 or 10 kids enjoying the cooling off effect of the drowning each other with buckets of water. We would turn our attention to the main road out in front of Mike's house. Heaven help a car that would come by with its windows rolled down. Need I say more? This yearly war lasted all night long. Sometimes it turned into a water balloon fight, but most of the time we were too poor to buy balloons. In the morning time after the town fathers would shoot off the cannon at 5 a.m. and all the town would gather in the town meeting down at the old school building. We would all pledge allegiance to the flag, someone to give a patriotic speech, and then we would run races, sack races, 3-legged races, then just race around like wild Indians until the Relief Society set out the food and we would eat ourselves sick. And then we'd go home and sleep. Well, this is pretty cool, huh? Don't you believe this was a Bunkerville yearly event we look forward to? Well, on with other water stories. I guess there was so much water shortage in our life, focus came around water. As I grew a little older, I discovered girls. But when I was younger, I guess water was important. So it was, we started enjoying drawing attention to ourselves by doing stupid things. Back then, Sunday school and priesthood meeting were held in the morning. Sacrament meeting was held in the evening. One Sunday after church, a couple of us boys headed for Lauren Levitt's and his wife old house. But now Lauren and his son Cecil had to attend another church meeting after sacrament meeting. So they would not be home till after 9 o'clock that night. That left the 3 girls home alone in their big 2-story ancient spooky house. I have to explain here there's no disrespect to our black brothers and sisters. I don't think that anyone in Bunkerville at that time had ever seen a black person.
And I grew up calling Brazil nuts nigger toes because that was what my mom called them, and they were her favorite nuts, and that's what she called them all of her life, even till she passed away. Anyway, back to the process of staring the girls. This was an opportunity for nigger knocking. We knocked on the house and windows of the doors and ran before anybody could catch us. We'd disappear into the blackness of the night and hide. Well, that was cool, huh? It was well after dark when the knocking proceeded. We thought we were so smart. We'd bang away at the doors and windows and hear the girls inside scream, and then we would run like the dickens. We didn't get time to get tired of the game. It only lasted 2 or 3 times, and on the fourth time we started on our unearthly rapping. Out came Brother Levitt and Cecil, still dressed in their church clothes, with fire in their eyes and murder in their hearts. We were only fooling, folks. We weren't doing anything, were we? We scattered. Now, I don't know why every time it seems when someone decides to chase us guys, they always took after me. I don't think anyone ever caught me, but nonetheless, it seems that I always became the focus of their wrath. And it was so that night. I couldn't believe it. Both Dad and the son got hot on my trail. And there were other boys that they could have chased, but no, it was just me. They pursued me. I was pursued by the raging dad and the son. I did not think to simply stop and say in a calm, soothing voice, "We were only fooling, you know." That thought never ever entered my head. I just ran and ran and ran and ran some more. And they wouldn't give up. I ran past the church and ran west to the bishop's house and ran 2 more blocks to the mouth of the old dirt line that separated a whole bunch of farmers' fields. They were still fast on my tail. Well, as Providence often did for me, the big ditch ran right alongside of that dirt road. As my breath started to come in gasps and Lauren and Cecil started to gain on me, I noticed the willows that were starting to cover the ditch and hide it from view. Now, you have to realize that it was the night of a full moon, and I think most of my escapades happened on nights with full moons. So I wonder why. Werewolves really don't come out in the full moons, do they? I don't know what the full moon does to people, but it does. Anyway, I soon realized that my choices were really running out. So, with a gape in the reeds, I presented it. I dove, church clothes and all, into that big ditch. I held my breath and swam under the water as long as I could. Then I surfaced, trying to breathe quietly. I swam to the side of the ditch where the brush was the thickest, and then I listened. I could hear the reeds along the bank being smashed. I could hear an old man breathing hard. "I'm going to get that little bugger." You knew who he was? I didn't get a good look at his face, so I moved further in the hidey hole, sinking again underneath water. This time before I came up, I thought I'd die of asphyxiation. I do believe it had been 5 whole minutes before I appeared before the water. Well, at least it was at least 30 seconds. The sound of their thrashing and cussing had moved away from me and became less and less loud. As I listened, it finally stopped, but I wasn't going to be fooled. I did not come out of the ditch right away. I knew they were waiting for me, quietly, just waiting for me to appear. So I waited and waited and waited. When I was certain that they had gone, I climbed out of the ditch and went home, stripped naked, sneaked into the house, and went to bed. I only had one set of church clothes, and I had ruined them that night, so I had to make up a good story of how I slipped and fallen when I was walking by the ditch at home late last night after a ironic priesthood meeting. Well, part of it was true. I did fall into the ditch. While I'm on a rock and a roll about the big ditch, about being chased, and about hiding, here's another story. It was after church again on a Sunday night. Well, it was a moonlight night again. Why do these things always happen to me? Anyway, there's a whole bunch of us this time, and it was dark, moonlight dark. We were out in front of Bishop Dan Waite's house. It had to be in the middle of September. His hedge pomegranates were ripe and about the size of softballs, or even bigger. There were about 1,000,000 of those pinkish, huge throw things hanging from the branches of the bush. A night just made for a pomegranate fight. The war of all wars. Now you have to realize that a war with ammunition that hard and as big as you could really kill someone. But did we care? Yeah, well, but who would think of anything but seeing those big bombs broke up upon somebody's white T-shirt and creating such a stain that even your mother Tide couldn't get the darn dent in the dirt. It was this idea in her head that the plan evolved. We all had to wear white T-shirts. Before church was even out, we had chosen sides. I think I became the leader of the East Side Warriors, and Roger Bunker chosen to be the charge of the West Side Warriors. That night drew on. The time drew near. Bishop Waite would still be in church meetings about till midnight, I thought. Everyone arrived. All the missiles started to fly. It hurt so darn bad that when one of those bombs hit, especially if they didn't break open and splatter with red juice, it just about killed it. I don't know how long the war lasted. I think it was too late, and too long. But out of the light of a bright moon, like a ghost in the darkness, here appeared Bishop Dan Waite. And you are right. He took after me. It doesn't figure, does it? Well, as you know, Dan Waite, the bishop, lived there on Main Street, so it became a foot race once more. He was hot on my trail, but I was fast little bucker back then, especially with the bishop in his bishop suit and a few paces to my rear. I cut through Mike Waite's backyard. Why didn't he take after Mike Waite? After all, Mike was his nephew. Maybe that's why, of course, I really didn't believe everyone had it out for me, or would it be in for me, or whatever it was. I don't know. I cut up through Mike's fig trees, weaved my way through Mike's pomegranate orchard. Why didn't we just have a war with Mike's pomegranates? I don't know. I actually flew up the road just below the Waite's dairy barn, and I was really on my game. No one could have caught me that night, but I came to the big ditch. I couldn't believe it. Why did everything have to end up at the big ditch? That night, I would not succumb to the water barrier. I would not ruin my Sunday best pants and my T-shirt. That was important also. Well, it turned out I didn't have to die into the murky depths. Just behind the barn, flanking the ditch, there was a barrier. There was a magnificent barrier of rabbit brush. Now, if you don't know about rabbit brush, well, I've explained it once before, but let me explain again. Rabbit brush plays a big part into most of the stories that I tell. So it is named because rabbits make tunnels throughout the lower branches. It is so dense that even in the daylight you can only see a few feet into the depths. So I was saved. I dove into the brush and held my breath and waited. All too soon the bishop appeared. He came very quietly. He listened. He looked. He held his breath. He walked along the barrier of brush. I was laying on my stomach in the dirt, in my church pants and my t shirt, trying to keep my beating heart from giving me away. Well, he stopped right in front of me. I was dead. I knew I was dead. I could see the moonlight shine off the eyelets of his Sunday shoes. I think if he moved his foot another inch forward, then he would have hit me in the nose. I could have licked his toes, and time stood still. My life passed in front of my eyes. Then he turned and headed back to his house. I was safe. Once again, I had won. Anyway, so I thought until the very next day. That was when Roger Bunker, the piss on you trader, gave us all up. There wasn't much to do in Bunkerville for us young boys, as you can tell, except for work. And especially in the summer when school was out, we had to make our own entertainment. That is when we weren't working on the farms. Speaking of farms, I remember how glad I was when I started to be hired out to haul hay for some of the farmers. They would actually pay for help. And we started at 75 cents an hour. I think by that time I was 17, they were paying a whole dollar an hour. But I digress. I want to tell you now about our made up activities on hot summer days. There was a time before cars' inner tubes were black that manufacturers made inner tubes out of red rubber. That red rubber was premium rubber. When I came along to Bunkerville Way of Life, it was a treasure find to find a rubber inner tube. To discover a car tire that had red rubber inner tube inside was like finding a gold mine. The black tubes didn't have the stretching elasticity, and were not even good for flippers. That was the slingshots that we hunted the little birds and animals with. Now, in order to make good flippers, you first had to find a good tree crotch, one that had the right curve to it, one that was made out of hardwood, one that was worthy of red rubber. That is to say, it could send a perfect rock selling from the leather pouch, and 9 times out of 10 score a direct hit. As a boy, I think I clobbered about 1,000,000 birds with my flipper, and those are another stories. But this story has to do with the kids now that I call war. The point paintball, the paintball craze took over the game we called rubbers, and that was war with inner tubes. When we first started to organize the game, we had red rubber inner tubes from cars that worked with. Well, as time come and went, red rubber was replaced with black rubber. You know, all things change, don't they? But we made the change with rubber bands. That's how we would cut the circular bands from the inner tubes. You know, like just regular rubber bands. We would tie them together in a chain of 3 or 4, and that would create our ammunition. We'd carry a total of 4 shots, 3 rubber band chains hanging from our reserve fingers, making the ammo handy to quickly move it into a firing position. The firing band we locked and loaded over our index finger of our left hand. stretched it back to the very limits with its right hand, and then would let it fly at our opponent. The rules of the game were simple, and they were. You couldn't wear a shirt, thus exposing your upper torso to the welt rising rubber bands. There was no shooting from the head, and other than that, you were fair game for the game of rubbers. And so it happened there was an ideal place to play out our game of war right across the street from Mike Waite's and Ronnie Hardy's homes. It was an old abandoned 2-story barn. The rigors of time had turned all the wood of this monstrosity into a weathered gray building that nowadays is sought for after those artificiers who scour the land looking for the wood of such buildings. But back in those times, it was just a haunted barn with about 1,000 little hidden tack rooms filling its old weathered straw, which made it an excellent hiding place. One team, therefore, would get in to hide in the barn while the other side would wait patiently to begin the fight. And what a war it would become. I hated it when the older kids played with us because they could raise welts against your back or belly that would last there forever. It was not unusual for one of us little kids, when confronted by one of those monstrosity combatants of old kids, with their loaded rubber bands pulled back to the breaking point, to yell out, "I give up, I give up, don't shoot me, I give up, I give up." Sometimes the big kids would let the other opponents give up, but more than likely he would not. This brought tears to the eyes and welts to the bodies of us little kids. Of course, I would never just give up, or did I? The game would thus proceed, sometimes all day long, until it was too dark to see who was on whose team. Then we'd just agree to put off the winning for another day. I think, though, when night fell, we'd always count up each battle and see who was ahead. The big kids are always cheated, though. The barn itself was such a good place to hide. On the ground floor, there were so many little rooms, but the second floor was just one big open room with a lot of straw and nowhere to hide. We'd always choose someone to go up there so he could shoot down on the other team. The biggest kids with the strongest arms were always chosen for that position. Even though you knew where he would be, it was really hard to shoot up and hit him. The rest of us would scatter into hiding places on the first floor. I liked to bury myself in the bales of straw, which over the time became loose and broken up to be just loose mounds of straw. At the end of the day, I would always be sorry because the straw would cause the exposed skin to break out into itchy red rash, which would be worse than the welts that raised from the big kids. But then I was usually last to die or last to win just because I was such a good hider. Next story was about my cave of dreams. Somewhere between my 15th and 16th year, I began to spend a lot of time in the mountains. That is, the Virgin Mountains, just south of Bunkerville. To the foot of the mountains is a good 7 miles. I hiked the desert a lot with my old black dog, Girl. An original name for a female black dog, don't you think? Oh, I better pause here just a moment to relate a story about Girl. Kenny Adams' dad now had the name of Durrell Adams. One evening when I had a few scraps of food to feed my dog, I opened the kitchen door and yelled out into the night, "Here, Girl! Here, Girl! Hey, Girl, come and get it!" And yes, Durrell Adams answered, "What do you want of me?" I was so surprised at the voice coming out of the darkness. I, of
quickly replied, oh, nothing, Durrell. I was just yelling. Well, don't call me if you don't want anything. He went into his house and I heard the door slam because it became a good story, though. I like to tell to the other kids. Now back to my cave. As I wandered through the desert with the girl at my side and my trusty 22 in my hand, I went further and further from home. Finally, I somehow convinced my mom and my dad that it was okay to spend the night out alone. And so my quest to find a secret place, a cave to call my own, began. One night in the desert turned into 2 nights in the desert. Then ultimately during the summer and on vacation days, I'd be gone for almost a week at a time. To soothe the anxiety of my mom, I'd take my dad out back of our house and point out where on the mountain I was planning to go, where my old cave of dreams would be. It was during one of the first forays I came upon my cave of dreams. Well, it wasn't much of a cave, but it sat high above the desert foot at the foot of the mountain. It had a good spring just out the front door, and I had a good vantage point where I could see across the whole valley. But the best thing was that I could sit in my cave and pop off quail and chuckers in the evening and in the morning if I've a mind to. And all sorts of little animals would wander in to drink, including me. I drank there. I guess I should explain that a chucker was bigger than a quail, and I think it was a cross between a quail and a sage hen. Hence, it was a bigger bird and a bit tastier. So it was that I started to make my cave a more comfortable place. The mouth of the cave was quite large, and the cave itself didn't go back very far. The rock that surrounded me at night would reflect the heat from my fire in the wintertime, and it was cool enough in the summer to be very comfortable. I did build a small wind wall out of rocks a couple of feet high, so when the wind blew and the walls protected my fire and me and girl, it would protect it from the wind. When the few times it did rain, we were out of the weather, and all of my cave of dreams made an excellent escape from the world, and that's exactly what I wanted. I mentioned that I grew up at a time when the United States was testing atom bombs, and that the Cold War with Russia was raging. It seemed all the world was on the brink of nuclear war, so I started to hoard canned food in my cave. Each time I hiked into the mountain, I'd load my Boy Scout backpack up with canned food. And when I reached my cave, I'd bury the cans in the gravelly bottom, far back in the dark recesses of that dark cave. I will pause here again, once more, on our second anniversary of my second marriage. Grandma, my name for my wife, Mary Lee, and I did a four-wheel truck drive to the mountain, and we were able to locate my cave of dreams. By then, it had been 60 years had whizzed by, and I'd discovered and found my cave of dreams. As we dug into the rocky bottom of the caves, we found canned food still intact, however, bulging at the seams. Now, back to the story in my cave at night. I would light a small fire, lay in my sleeping bag, find me a good rock for a pillow, read a book. Sometimes it was my small copy of the Book of Mormon, or it might have been the Book of High Adventure from Zane Grey. I was in my little part of heaven with my dog and my 22 right by my side. Some nights I could hear mountain lions cry. It sounded like a woman screaming or a baby crying. A couple of times during the day, I took a shot or two at a mountain lion, and it was probably a good thing I didn't hit one. Of course, the cows and the deer would come wandering in for water from the spring. For a lonely young man, I appreciated their company. I had become a mountain man, you know.
I would like hiking the mountain looking for old Spanish mines, for old Indian caves, for outcroppings of gold. I don't think I ever found quartz that they would hold the yellow mineral, but nonetheless, I explored everything and anything that was out of the ordinary for me. One Saturday night, while I was tucked in snugly in my sleeping bag reading, it started to snow. I could not believe it. It never snowed in the valley, maybe on Noon Peak, the highest peak on the mountain, but not in the valley. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever witnessed. The quietness of the big flakes seemed to muffle the world. Girl got so excited at first she ran out trying to bite and chase all the snowflakes. She soon tired and came back in and lay down on the sleeping bag by the fire and just watched and wondered, just like I was doing. Little did I know that the snow had completely different effect on the family. Mom panicked. She had Dad and Stan take my old single shot 12 gauge shotgun, get in Grandpa's Capple's Jeep, and head out to save me from the ravages of the storm. The problem was, even though I had pointed out where my cave location was many times to both Dad and Stan, they had no idea where to start looking for me. Instead of heading straight up the mountain to my cave, they did not take the 4x4 trail that would lead them even close to the cave. They headed instead for a dirt road that they knew. Unfortunately, the rocky road took them about 10 miles away from my hidey hole. They ended up at Gold Butte and then at Devil's Gate at the far west base of the mountain. They hiked around in the snow, shooting off the 12 gauge and yelling at me with no response. They finally gave up about 2 in the morning and went home and had to listen to Mom cuss all night. In the morning, I awakened to such a marvelous sight. Everything was white. I never had seen it this way before. Everything was so crystal clear. I could see the smoke coming out of the chimneys in Bunkerville and even over into Mesquite. I could see the white mountains on Utah Hill to the north and to the east. I could see even the mountains up in by Enterprise, Utah. It was like a fairyland, a fairyland, I might say. It was the only time that anything so beautiful covered that desert floor of Virgin Valley. As I finally came out of the trance that seemed to hold me bound, I realized that probably my folks would be just a little worried about me. Of course, they had not seen snow like this before. Snow in Utah thing, not a Nevada thing. So, regretting what I had to do, I started home. I arrived Sunday afternoon. I had to skip church. At that time, that was part of the plan, wasn't it? I found out, though, that my mom had stayed home to watch for me. And I did get the dickens this time. And my mom swore that I'd never go to that mountain again alone. But as time came and went, well, so did I. End of chapter. Chapter 3. Let me pause a minute here and add to the reading of this trilogy and this life and times of mine and explain that to begin with, I wanted it to be more professional. But being that I am now over 81 and approaching 82 years old, I find myself in my brain and my vocal expressions such that that was not meant to be. So if you'll bear with me, hopefully, especially when we get into the trilogy of Montezuma's Maze, you'll forgive a lot of my diction and my
mispronunciation and everything else. Because I do think the trilogy that I've just finished with reading to Grandma Marilee is much better than my life history. And so please bear with me. So we begin chapter 3 with my teenage years. When I was about 15 years old, Dad let me buy a motor scooter from Sears and Roebuck's. It was an all-state motor scooter, and probably the top speed was about 40 miles an hour. And I think that would be downhill with the wind at my back. It did run good though, and I could work on it pretty well. I would always be taking it apart, cleaning the carburetor, and just see what made it run. You don't see this type of motor scooter anymore, just about any place. It had a long metal cover that ran from the front seat to the back end of it, and it was in one piece. It looked kind of like a turtle shell and only came off in one piece when the shell was open to the front and the bottom. It was fairly easy to unbolt a few bolts and remove, I guess you'd call it a piece, was a cowl. Anyway, this cowl was encased all of the motor and was pretty good protection for the scooter. The dimensions of the cowl were about 4 feet long by 2.5 feet high by it sloped backwards to the ground on the back. One thing that I became obsessed with was its paint job. I think about every other month or every 2 or 3 months, I would change colors. Some extreme paint jobs I did to the poor thing were once I marked it off with 2-inch squares and painted the whole thing black and pink, a checkerboard. Then there was another time I painted it green with white flames. Then just black on black and white on white, and I don't think there was a scooter ever wore this type of a paint job. I just got to the point that I could walk faster than I could ride it. And I thought that it lost all of its compression, so I don't know what happened after it died. Now, there were about 8 of us in Bunkerville who had bought scooters all about the same time. And they were all state, except for Kenny Adams. His folks bought him a Vesta, an Italian-made piece of junk that he thought that he was cooler than the rest of us. To each his own, I guess. Every once in a while, we had an all-state gang. We would get together and play hide and seek. We'd choose up sides. One side would hide, while the other side, after about 5 or 10 minutes, would go and seek them out. You have to realize that kids that were hiding would have to find some really good hiding places. Then they would turn off the machine so the seekers could not hear the motor running and the putt-putting around. So when they weren't hiders, they had to find some pretty good hiding places to hide. We would run our scooters into tamarack trees and cover them with limbs and junk to hide them out, and we would hide them in dairy farms, and which the farmers didn't appreciate. But the neatest place I ever hid my scooter was on the roof of an old chicken coop, right in the middle of town. Me and Ronnie Hardy got this idea, and we were on the same side at that particular time. He helped me lift my scooter up to the top of the rotten coop, and I helped him lift his scooter up. Those things probably weighed about 100 pounds is all, so
But it was no small matter for two young boys to lift the heavy suckers up over their heads and to the top of the chicken coop. The only bad thing we found out that we had to lay the scooters on their side when we reached the top so they couldn't be seen from the road. And we found out that when you lay the scooters on its side, it tends to lose all of its gas out the top of its gas tank. So, to fix the small problem, we just jerked off our shirts and stuffed them in the top of the gas tank. Problem solved. Anyway, that's what we thought. As time ran on, the search for me and Ronnie continued. The night the shirts became soaked and the fumes about killed us. If anyone were to light a match, we'd both have gone up in flames. But we were never caught. Let me say this about that, though. It was almost an impossible task to recover two 100-pound gasoline-soaked scooters from the top of the old chicken coop, at least for the two 15-year-old kids in the dark of the night. You soon seem to learn by experience. Well, sometimes. Well, and then there not too many times, probably. As time progressed, the scooters were traded in for Harley Davidson's motorcycle. Sam owned a Black Beauty and rode it a couple of wild kids from Mesquite. I remember the one was named Tuffy Roof. He was a beer drunken, cigarette smoking wild angel, all right. And a year or so after Stan had graduated from high school, he blew the engine on his beautiful bike, and I bought it from him for $500. I had the motor fixed and became known as the King of Bunkerville, and that was cool. There used to be a TV program called Happy Days, and there was a kid called the Fonz that rode a cool bike. And he was the object of a hero, a pattern for a young life. Well, somewhat. I was a lone wolf. I had a Harley, a kick start, hand shift, flat head, suicide clutch, 1940 edition, the biggest and baddest and blackest, most chromed up bike you ever saw. And you have to realize that I was really cool, or at least that's what I thought. I even got me a pair of white Levi's and a white jacket, and I became the White Knight of Bunkerville. Can you feature that? Instead of following the wild side, I was the defender of the downtrodden, the friend of the weak, and the walked upon. You can even ask John Prowse about that later story. He was Brother Prowse's 40-year-old son that used to follow me around all the time. I became the hero of the valley. Well, in my own mind. I tend to blow up my own horn too much, don't I? But that became my goal. I was one cool kid, and the whole school would ask every wallflower to dance at every school dance. And they all became my best friends, and they would be my best advocates. They were and still are to this day the coolest of the cool. But back to my story. I seem to jump ahead of myself in timeline, don't I? Because I rode my motorcycle until I joined the Navy right out of high school. And I have a lot of other childhood stories to tell. But as far as the White Knight was concerned, when the new school was built in Mesquite, I rode the bike to seminary every morning, except the mornings I couldn't kickstart it and get it going. And then I rode with Mr. Prowse, who was our early morning seminary teacher. And he had a cool 55 baby blue and white two-door Chevy that was all right to ride in his car, and really didn't diminish my image too much. Well, while I'm hearing the story of my life, I have to tell you a little bit about Brother Prowse. if we were to jump ahead 60 some years, last year I had the privilege to attend Brother Prouse's 90th birthday party. There were only 4 of his students that were invited from his teaching years in Bunkerville and Mesquite, so I felt fortunate. All of the rest of the group were children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren of Brother Prowse. Minister Prowse taught not only early seminary at the high school, but he also taught all of the sciences, math classes, and coached the tennis team. I'll have to admit, though, high school team tennis was a sissy game, a game that I could not be involved in. I played basketball, my chosen sport, baseball, swimming, river running during the flood stage, etc. I had my image to live up to, as you know. Mr. Prowse was kind of my hero during the school times, someone that I wanted to be like. He was always happy. He was so interested in his students. I think it was the reason I wanted to be a seminary teacher and took those classes at BYU to become a seminary teacher. And, that's another story. He always was laughing at our jokes, always was helping us work out our teenage problems. And in Bunkerville, he became a member of the bishopric. I remember particularly his small son, John. When I walked to high school, I always walked a quarter of a mile to the school building. But going and coming to the old high school, little John, most of the time would be playing out front of his house, which was right along the side of the only tarred and paved road in Bunkerville. Just a block from the school, he would always run out and talk to me. The picture I still hold of him in my mind is the scuffy little 4-year-old boy in Levi's. He wore his tennis shoes, laces undone, with a T-shirt that was one size too small for him. His belly was hanging out and belly button exposed, and his hair, especially his cowlick, was sticking up like a haystack. I always thought that even back then, someday I'd like to have a son just like him. Like they say, you better not wish for things, 'cause you might just get 'em. I did. 5 sons, just as rowdy as the little old John. Now, one day in biology, which was the first class of the day, Mr. Prowse started the class on his humorous stories. Last night, he began, as I came home to the house, I smelled something was cooking. What you cooking? I asked the missus. Oh, I'm not cooking anything, Sister Prowse replied. He walked over to the oven, opened it up, and lo and behold, there was a kitten fully cooked, eyes bulging out and ready for the supper table. Mr. Prowse was laughing in tears when he told that story in school, and by the end we were all laughing. Boy, that was some memory, huh? Another time, on our way to early morning seminary, a day of black beauty would not start. There were 4 of us riding with him that morning. I was riding shotgun. When I had to ride with Mr. Frost, I always rode shotgun. That was my self-appointed place. As we crossed the Virgin River Bridge to Mesquite, there happened to be a huge bobcat right in the middle of the bridge. Hit it, I yelled. Sure enough, he floored the gas and ran it down. Both Mr. Prowse and me jumped out and started back toward the cat. Well, that bobcat jumped up as we approached it and growled at us. And then with one mighty leap, it went over the side of the bridge into the Virgin River, some 40 feet below. We could not believe it. I really think that we were the lucky ones that morning. The cat let us live, not the other way around. One more of Brother Proust's story, and I'll let him go. All his life, Brother Proust wanted to teach college and be a professor. So after teaching for years in Virgin Valley, and after I went into the Navy, he went back to college and received his PhD. He then applied to about a dozen colleges to become professors in their science departments. They all turned him down the first time. He and his family could not believe it. All of the family had sacrificed for his schooling, for his dream, but everything was for nothing, it seemed. Discouraged, he applied for a job with Huntsman Corporation in Houston, Texas, and he was accepted right away. Again, it don't figure, does it? Our dreams seem to always be put on hold or be as nothing with the Lord, it seems. Well, he moved his family to Texas, and as they waited to find a house, and as they were looking around, they lived in a motel. And then he got a call from the stake president in the state that they were planning to move into. As the stake presidency visited with Brother and Sister Prowse, he told him that the ward that they were planning to move into were having some problems. Half the ward wouldn't come to church because of some gospel doctrine that was being preached was not in line with what they thought that the gospel should be. And there was a great division in the ward. But Brother Price, in their conversation, he explained his dream of being a college professor and how they had prayed and fasted for a position with a college, and that would continue to follow his dream and keep submitting the qualifications to different colleges until he could find a job. That was his dream. But on the other hand, the stake president, the Lord, and the whole presidency said to him, Brother Prowse, we prayed you here. The Lord answered our prayers, and you are supposed to be the next bishop of that ward. And in 5 years, when the calling is fulfilled, the Lord will bless you with your goal to follow your dreams. But right now, the Lord wants you here. Right now, right here where you are. You are to answer our prayers. It's the Lord's will that you'll be right here, right now, and receive the call that has been preparing for you. 5 years later, Brother Prowse was released as bishop, and he was accepted as professor at Ricks College in Idaho. And I think that's really neat, don't you? I don't think Bishop Prowse had ever attended the ward in Houston where he became bishop before the visit from the stake president and the whole presidency. Well, that does figure, huh? If the Lord played you there, or if the Lord listened to the prayers, good old Brother Prowse answered it. It was when I turned 16, just before I had my driver's license, driving the motor school, hauling hay from farm trucks, and sneaking over to J.L. Buller's store in my dad's car, were all before I had a driver's license. I guess all of us kids considered the same importance to have a driver's license as having a hunting license. It just wasn't necessary. There was an older kid down the block that had graduated from high school several years before that owned a 1949 Chevy convertible, which is really cool woody, those kind that have wood on the sides that looked like a surfer van. It even ran after a fashion, well, most of the time. We heard that he was willing to sell that one-of-a-kind antique vehicle for the unbelievable price of $50. Four of my buddies and I figured, even though we were not mathematical geniuses, that if each of us would put in $10, that our grand total would be enough to purchase that beauty of a car. So the five of us went on to visit the owner of the prize, and we started it up. It ran. And of course, after cleaning its throat of a big bunch of black billowing smoke, it ran fairly well. As a wise buyer or buyers, we had to take it for a little test ride to check it out. Oh yeah. Did I mention that the canvas top was torn and that it would not come up, or that it only had one headlight, or that it never had, well, I guess it did have tail lights, but the brake lights worked, and that was a plus, and it did run. It was just about dark when we decided to try it out. Now you have to be aware that there was only one cop in town. It covered Mesquite and Bunkerville. He was also a highway patrol officer. So his main duty was to look after the criminals that came through Mesquite on Old 91. And we hardly saw him in Bunkerville. That's why we had no licenses of any kind between any of the five of us, because we could get away with it. Well, his name was Oscar Abbott, the highway patrol officer. We called him Old Ock. He had even had a signed letter from President of the United States, which you can see today in the police station at Mesquite, Nevada. It is a commendation from the most stolen cars recovered in the whole United States. What an accomplishment. It was straight from the President of the United States. And you had to realize that when he received a call, Old received anyway, it was a call on a stolen car, either from Las Vegas or St. George, Utah. There was only one road into and one road out of Mesquite, Nevada. So he would set up at the Arizona state line, where the road came into the state of Nevada from Arizona. And there was only about 12 miles of Old 91 where it crossed the corner of Arizona. Anyway, it was on the top of what then was known as Airport Hill, where an old dirt airport landing spot was. He would sit there with his Tommy gun on Airport Hill, right at the state line. No one would get by his roadblock. If they tried, they would be dead meat. He was rough, really an old-time cop. Now, to continue on the story of the 49 convertible, the five of us climbed into the car and away we went. We had to see what it would do on Old Highway 91, and the speedometer did read 120, but we had to know if it could do that speed. We headed up toward Mesquite, and I was driving at 60 miles an hour when our front wheel started to wobble so bad it felt like the car was going to fly apart. But I had to see, I got it up to 65 when Oscar Abbott passed us going the other way in his patrol car. By that time it had turned dark and as black as a Halloween cat. But our one headlight did a pretty good job in lighting the road ahead. I looked into my one mirror that the car had, and I saw old Ock turn on his overhead lights and do a U-turn on Old 91 and turn to chase us. Now, I knew that just before the Virgin River Bridge, going over the river to Mesquite, there was a dirt road that cut off and ran up by the riverside to the east, and there were a lot of sandy washes that took off from that road. Well, I took the road, and what else could I do? Ock Abbott, with his lights flashing and his sirens screaming in the night, was lost in our dust that rose like a cloud in the dirt road. We could not even see his lights, but we sure could hear his siren hot on our trail. We could hear it loud and clear. Well, the chase was on. We skidded around turns, making so much dust as we could. All of us kids were just scared to death. We knew that we were going to jail. About that time, a large wash opened up to our right. I did a 90-degree turn and floored it. I switched off the headlights, turned off the ignition, and we never hit the brakes. And we kind of coasted to a stop in the sandy wash from 65 to nothing in no time. It was a good thing that I never stepped on the brakes because a few seconds later, old Doc came flying by with lights a flashing and sirens a screaming. I knew it'd be just a matter of minutes before he had realized no one was in front of him on that dirt road. No billowing dust. So I hit the ignition, back down the gully, headed for home, and I had to turn on one headlight to even see the road again. We didn't care about anything else. We were just fleeing for our lives. We were fleeing felons in our own mind. Well, I really don't know why Ock didn't catch us. Maybe he just wanted to give us a good scare, or maybe he got to a place where he couldn't turn around. But the good Lord was with us that night. Well, you think he was? Maybe it wasn't the good Lord that got us home. Now, another Ock Abbott story. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about that car. We took it and went back to the owner and said, well, I think that it would take a little too much money to fix it up more, and so we're not going to buy it. But now to another Ock Abbott story. On the airport hill, there was a place that the cross-country truck drivers would park on alongside of the old 91 and sleep and just rest and check things out before they started their climb over Utah Hill. In those days, it was the long haul drivers over Utah Hill. Many a truck overheated and broke down because of the desert temperatures and because of the steep grade. And also, there was plenty of tourists that stopped and rested in the same pull-off there at the side of Airport Hill. It was a good place to check things out. One night, one of the older kids copped a blank gun out of his dad's top chest of drawers, and it was really cool. It looked like a real pistol, so the plan began to form. About four of us got into one of the old guy's cars and drove up the hill. Now we made darn sure that old Locke was not lurking around anywhere. We made sure that there were some old semi drivers and tourists pulled off by the side of the road. In order for all of this to really work, we had to have an audience. It wouldn't have been the same without an audience, you know. One of us jumped out of the car and started to yell at another kid who was still inside. The two proceeded to yell back and forth, making one heck of a racket. The one kid outside of the car reached in and dragged the other one out. While still screaming back and forth, he drew the blank gun and fired 2 shots at the victim. Well, you never saw such a performance. The one feigning being shot flew backwards on the side of the car. Boy, he did an excellent job. He rolled along the side of it until he came to the trunk area, where he sprawled down, sliding and grabbing himself all the time, screaming, I'm dead, I'm dead, you killed me, you killed me. By then, our driver was out of the car with a key in hand. He opened the trunk. We all piled out and hoisted the limp body in, slammed the trunk of the lid shut, and climbed over each other, getting back into the getaway car. Well, we dug out. We really dug out, throwing dirt and gravel everywhere, making such a dust cloud it took really, really a long time for it to settle down. We headed back into Mesquite, just a half mile away. Well, we hid the car in the kid's old garage, and
and we all scattered. It is all about finding things to do that you would get arrested for nowadays. Actually, I was a pretty good kid from all accounts. Well, maybe. Of course, there was that time when we found the old duck nest back of our house. Mike Wade and I got our slingshots, or our slings, that flung those eggs. By the way, they were rotten and smelled like old throwed up. Anyway, we flung them over an acre away to land on the koala's house. I really don't think we knew why we did it. Brother Koalas was then in the bishopric, and as I mentioned before, he was art teacher at the high school. But I guess we did it because we just wanted to see if we could do it. We were found out, of course, somebody squealed, and we had to wash off all the outside of his house. Then it was the time when we got in trouble again for using our slings. I guess I better describe what a sling really is. A sling is made out of two long pieces of leather, long leather shoelaces that work pretty good. Then you get a pretty big piece of leather for a pouch to hold rocks or whatever. I found out not rotten eggs, though. Tie shoelaces to the pouch by making little slits in the pouch's leather, and there you have it. Voila! You swing the sling around your head and let one of those shoelaces strings go. Away goes the ammo, flying to where you have predetermined to be your target. Well, remember David in the Bible killed Goliath with a stone from his sling, so you can get pretty darn accurate at times. As you have found out already, old 91 crossed the desert right above Bunkerville. The semi trucks were running day and night on the road. Well, one afternoon, we were really decided to test the range of our slings. We got up on a sand hill about a quarter of a mile above the highway and started to launch boulders toward the blacktop of the road. We soon found out that most of the time we could bounce the rocks off of our target, being the white line of the road. Well, that was pretty cool, you know.